Good evening, everyone. I'm Dr. Donald Wallenfang. What a pleasure to be with you on this live stream on the topic of Saint Edith Stein, her phenomenology, that she learned from her mentor, Professor Edmund Husserl. So this will be recorded to be able to post at a later date also. But I just wanted to try this out and have a live stream that you'd be able to ask questions, make comments as the presentation is happening. And again, that it will be recorded for later viewing. So we think, first of all, about the beginning of the movement called phenomenology in Western philosophy. And it's such an interesting movement to follow. Of course, it was predated by many things going on in Western philosophy, uh, all the way back to the beginning, really, thinking of pre Socratic philosophers. And this quest for making contact with the real, getting to the things themselves, as Husserl would say. So Edmund Husserl, born in 1859, died in 1938. He's born in a place called Prosnitz, then part of the Austrian Empire, and he was born into a Jewish family, like Edith Stein. He was the second of four children. He was baptized into the Lutheran Church in 1886 at the age of 27, 2 years after his father's death. So, very interesting, a convert to Christianity was Edmund Husserl. And he earned his doctorate in mathematics and then wrote his habilitation thesis entitled On the Concept of Number. So it was like a philosophy of mathematics. And in 1887, he would become a professor of philosophy in the German university system until the end of his life. He introduced the concept of phenomenology in his two-volume work entitled Logical Investigations, published in 1900 and 1901. And he would go on to write many books in phenomenology, thousands of pages, setting the course for this new philosophical method that would influence many prominent philosophers throughout the 20th century. Among them were Karol Wojtyła and Edith Stein, also Martin Heidegger, Maurice Merleau-Ponty, Paul Ricoeur, Emmanuel Levinas, and Hedwig Conrad Martius, Adolf Reinach. The list goes on and on. Those who studied the method of phenomenology. One of my favorite quotes about this method of phenomenology was from Pope John Paul II, who in a 2003 address to a delegation of the World Institute of Phenomenology of Hanover, he wrote this: "Phenomenology is primarily a style of thought, a relationship of the mind with reality, whose essential and constitutive features it aims to grasp, avoiding prejudice and schematisms. I mean that it is, as it were, an attitude of intellectual charity to the human being and the world, and for the believer to God, the beginning and end of all things. To overcome the crisis of meaning, which is characteristic of some sectors of modern thought, I insisted," he said, in the encyclical Fides et Ratio, the 1998 encyclical on faith and reason, on Catholic philosophy in the modern world, he insisted there on an openness to metaphysics, and phenomenology can make a significant contribution to this openness to classical metaphysics. So this is really quite interesting. I love how John Paul II defines phenomenology, along with Husserl, as this style of thought, of philosophy, that's aiming at the essential realities. What is essential in reality? What makes up what we mean when we say the real or reality? All of these given parts, the data of the real. And he says further, it's an attitude, it's an outlook, a worldview of intellectual charity. Just love that expression. I think it's so true about this method of phenomenology. And why not? The best science, the best philosophy, would it not be this dilation of consciousness, of intellectual activity, to take in the whole, the saturating whole of the real as much as possible? So it's this commitment, it's this radical commitment from the start to receive what gives itself by itself as itself, the things themselves. An attitude of intellectual charity, that is, of hospitality, of generosity, of a fundamental commitment to the possible. Because we can't say in advance, before the start of the game, before tip-off, before kickoff, before the launch, we cannot say what will give itself, what will not give itself. We await the data of lived experience, and that is good, responsible science, prudential science. Phenomenology is a science. We could call it the science of meaning, the science of experience, the science of everything that gives itself within lived experience. And so, as I write in my 2019 book, Phenomenology, A Basic Introduction, in the light of Jesus Christ, so with a theological turn involved in this book, it's still trying to introduce the reader to the basic concepts of phenomenology. But as I say in this book, on page, in the introduction, phenomenology is a step-by-step approach to the most certain and clear data of human experience. Phenomenology is a science. In fact, we could call phenomenology the science of science because it is the science of experience, any and all experience. Phenomenology, as the name suggests, is the science of phenomena. Phenomena refer to everything that gives itself within lived experience, especially in terms of meaning and signification. Not just concepts matching up with percepts or reference within perception, but phenomenology is after the things themselves, the phenomena themselves, what Immanuel Kant called the noumenon, the thing itself. But for Kant, the difference between Kant and Husserl is, for Kant, there's an unbridgeable gap between the thing in itself, the noumenon, and my perception of it, which he called the phenomenon. Husserl claims there's a fundamental unity between the noumenon and the phenomenon. They're one and the same thing, which he calls phenomenon, but the phenomenon is the thing itself. That I experience in my perception, my conscious perception, but what I experience is not just a representation in the mind of the thing in itself, whether object or idea or emotion. So many phenomena that light up our lived experiences, not just material things, but immaterial, in fact, spiritual meanings, significations, movements of this conscious spiritual life that we enjoy as human beings. So phenomenology gathers up all meanings given or signified within experience and describes them through the process of interpretation. For the science of phenomenology, phenomena themselves are its data. That word data, datum, comes from the Latin datus, giving, or datare, to keep giving. And this is the real, What keeps giving itself to us conscious, personal, spiritual subjects? All these phenomena that give themselves to our living perception. So, thinking more about Edmund Husserl. Edmund Husserl studied with the Catholic German philosopher and psychologist Franz Brentano. And Franz Brentano even was ordained a Catholic priest in 1864. He ended up leaving the priesthood in 1873, but in any case, he was very much influenced by this Catholic worldview. And Brentano is the one who really develops this concept of what's called intentionality that we talk about in phenomenology. And Husserl studied with Brentano in 1884 at the University of Vienna. In 1883, Husserl had written his first doctorate in mathematics entitled Contributions to the Calculus of Variation. And then in 1887, he writes his habilitation at the University of Halle in philosophy, and that's the one on the concept of number. In 1891, Husserl published the book, The Philosophy of Arithmetic. So Husserl was a mathematician at heart, but also a philosopher. And so when he writes his logical investigations and publishes them in 1900, 1901, what he's after is a recuperation of objectivity, of the real, overcoming this growing a movement called psychologism at the time, akin to what we would call today relativism, as if everything is reducible to individual subjective interpretation of things, and that all we could get at in philosophy, in social behavioral science, and any kind of science was simply our subjective perceptions of things, as if there's no anchor of objectivity within these subjective perceptions of the world. But Husserl says, no, let us return to the things themselves that actually come first in our lived experiences. When we think about our senses and the unity of our senses, are they not pure receptivity to what might give itself to them? The eyes don't invent the world as it looks. The ears don't invent the world as it sounds. The nose doesn't invent the world as it smells. But our senses are very porous. They simply receive everything that gives itself to them as it gives itself to them. So what comes first? Not thinking of this in metaphysical terms, that's something else and something important and necessary in itself. But in phenomenology, we simply want to receive and then describe what gives itself. So for Husserl, what seems to be the most important concept is what he calls givenness, or in German, Gegebenheit. The given. The given is the phenomenon. The phenomenon is what gives itself by itself. If we're describing the actual structure of experience, this is one of the best ways to describe it. I receive the visual data, the audible data, the olfactory data, the tactile and tangible data. I receive all of these, not just sense perceptions, though, not just an index of what the five senses receive, but what consciousness receives in terms of spiritual ideas, meanings, significations. Anything, the concept, we say the concept of anything. What do we mean by this? The concept of joy. What do we mean by this? The concept of sorrow. Language is always lagging behind the givens of experience. And we try to pin the tail on the perception with the concept. not always entirely successfully. But what is most essential for phenomenology are the data, the phenomena. And Husserl writes in Logical Investigations that pure phenomenology must bring to pure expression, must describe. That's the keyword for phenomenology. This is how it's different than metaphysics. Metaphysics seeks to explain in terms of being, existence, cause and effect, matter and form, act and potency, substance, accidents, all of these metaphysical categories, going back especially to Aristotle. Metaphysics wants to explain and answer the question why, with the response because, getting at the cause of a thing. Whereas phenomenology wants to bracket all of that and ask the question, how does it give itself? Pure phenomenology simply, as a method, receives and describes after bracketing the natural attitude. So there's really 3 steps in phenomenology, and I'd like to share my screen to talk about these. 3 main steps of phenomenology. Number 1 is to bracket, and I'll talk about bracket what. Number 2 is to receive, and number 3 is to describe. And we could even talk about a 4th if we want to, go as far as ethics. How do we respond to what gives itself? So bracket what Husserl calls the natural attitude. The natural attitude is essentially in reference to biases, presuppositions, all of these oftentimes unwarranted assumptions about the way things are. And this is a big problem for good philosophy and good science. For example, if we're trying to find a cure for cancer, we might wonder, why is there no cure for cancer yet? And we might reason, well, maybe it's possible to find because we haven't found it yet. But good science says we can't wave the white flag and give up searching for a cure for cancer. It's out there somewhere. It's still possible. It's definitely possible. And this is what phenomenology is doing by bracketing the natural attitude. We are not closing the doors prematurely on any possibility of what could give itself by itself, perhaps out of nowhere, unexpectedly, pure surprise. As Jean-Luc Marion puts it in his book Being Given, arrivage, the arrival of the phenomenon that we don't know. Where does it come from? In phenomenology, we're not concerned about its cause, its source. It's those metaphysical questions which have their place. But we simply want to be open, no filters, to receive what gives itself by itself. So in order to do this, we have to bracket the natural attitude. What we're bracketing here, we are reducing the reductionism from the start. The problem for philosophy is we often fall prey to the temptation of reductionism. There's many great ideas out there, but we can't say that Hegel got everything right, that the Hegelian system is the total. And that's a big problem with Hegel. He's after this totality, and he's trying to construct a system that seems to represent the whole. But because of the Aufhebung, the sublation, the collapse of the otherness, in fact, it's a fragmentation of the whole under the pretense of the whole. And in fact, what we get is a part that needs to be related to other parts, and the refusal of the closure of the dialectic. So we have great phenomenologists like Paul Ricoeur and Emmanuel Levinas talking about the refusal to let this otherness, this alterity, be reduced to the same, because that's not the truth about what gives itself in our lived experience. So the first step for phenomenology, to bracket the natural attitude. The second step, to receive all that gives itself. And these are the phenomena of lived experiences. Phenomena. Okay. And third, we have to describe what we received in lived experience. Describe. I don't want to use the language of what, it's too metaphysical. Describe the phenomenon as, and that's the interpretive as it gives itself. And then finally, there's the possibility of the ethical response. Respond to the meaning and meaningfulness of the phenomena. So I'll keep working at screen sharing here, and sometimes it's hit or miss. So we'll see how that turns out. But 4 steps I'm suggesting of Husserlian phenomenology that is taken up by Edith Stein. Bracket the natural attitude. Receive all the phenomena as they give themselves by themselves. Describe what gives itself. And then respond in the end. Act toward the meaningfulness of all that is given itself, and from this meaningfulness. So Husserl, further in his logical investigations, talks about pure phenomenology that represents a field of neutral researches in which several sciences have their roots. So neutral researches, phenomenology brackets the natural attitude, brackets metaphysics, brackets judgment in advance. We don't want to pronounce a judgment before we perform the experiment. Hypotheses, even in phenomenology, we try not to make hypotheses about what might give itself. We simply await the data and simply describe them. And finally, he talks about meanings, inspired only by remote, confused, inauthentic intuitions. If by any intuitions at all are not enough, we must go back to the things themselves. Go back to the things themselves. Zu den Sachen selbst, he says in German. So this is Husserl's idea, what he's up to, getting back to the things themselves, and not these remote, what he calls transcendent forms of givenness outside consciousness, but the things themselves are what give themselves all the way into the heart of consciousness. Okay. So then with Husserl, he has many bright students. One of them is Edith Stein. And she originally wanted to study German language and literature, history, and then she got interested in psychology. But she was unsatisfied by psychology and psychology's subjectivism, or psychologism, or we can even say relativism, subjective relativism, the relativism of subjectivity. And she was really trying to get to the things themselves herself. And so she heard about Husserl in Göttingen in this movement of phenomenology, and she thought, I need to study with this guy. So she does, and she just eats it up. She eats everything up there, and eventually would become his assistant. Edith Stein, she wrote a work in the year 1929 when she was 38 years old, teaching at a Dominican school for girls and young women in Speyer. She wrote this work as she was translating Thomas Aquinas's work, Questiones Disputate de Veritate, Disputed Questions on Truth. So she's really learning all about scholastic metaphysics. And she writes a dialogue, a kind of imagined dialogue between Husserl and Aquinas. And so Heidegger was putting together a Festschrift in honor of Husserl's 70th birthday. It came together in 1929, and Edith was invited to contribute an essay. It's a dialogue between Aquinas and Husserl, and it's published in a book called Knowledge and Faith. The first essay in there called Husserl and Aquinas, A Comparison. It's a very interesting work by Stein because Aquinas does most of the talking in this imagined dialogue, and Stein, she's making the point here. I think she's making the point that phenomenology without relation to metaphysics in the end is not enough. And we need metaphysics. So if we're talking about Catholic philosophy, this is true. Metaphysics is what is known as perennial philosophy, the bedrock, the anchor of philosophy, because it's tethered to the real in terms of being. And so phenomenology in the contemporary world can help us to come alive again and resuscitate the question of being by dealing with questions of meaning first. Because the question of being, a metaphysical question of being, has come to lack meaning in our era. But meaning has not completely gone lacking in meaning in our era, even though there is the philosophical movement we call nihilism, which moves in that direction. But it's virtually impossible to get rid of meaning. We can't. Even in the negation of it, it's still a meaning. So phenomenology deals with all of these meanings and their positive aspects and negative ones. So in this work, Knowledge and Faith, where this essay is published on Husserl and Aquinas, this dialogue, Stein talks about this philosophia perennis, to search out the logos of this world, its ratio. This is something Edith herself was convinced about, what she lived for, to search after this truth, this logos of the universe. Laws of nature, natural law, moral laws, how things seem to be ordered in relation to each other. There is, after all, a logic, a legible logic that we live and breathe every day. Philosophy is a rigorous science that seeks to investigate the givenness of this logic and meaning that holds the woven universe together as a whole, as a saturating whole. So she's referring to this logos multiple times in this essay. And then she talks also about natural reason and how phenomenology tracks down skepticism and brings it back down to earth. This is a very important point for phenomenology, this return to the things themselves, this commitment to the things themselves as they give themselves by themselves, prevents us from drifting into this disorienting place of skepticism where we don't know up from down, left from right, good from evil, authentic from inauthentic. So Natural reason, though it has its limits and seems to never be able to reach its goal. However, so we see with Edith Stein here, a theological turn in her own thinking. And phenomenology guides her by the hand in this direction. What about the possibilities of divinity, divine revelation? And what might this divine knowledge have to teach us, where reason itself bumps up against its own limits? Divine knowledge, even as possibility, suggests the embrace of the completeness of truth. Otherwise, if we don't open to the possibilities of divine revelation, we are club members of rationalism. It's very clear. We can study the history of Western thought, the Western Enlightenment, the movements of rationalism, and we at least have to come clean about the matter. If we want to begin with these epistemological borders in our investigation, we at least have to admit the fact that that's what's going on. But good philosophy is not content to be delimited prematurely and without warrant. Good philosophy says, I think toward the whole, I receive all that gives itself and might give itself. And I am open to possibility, because thinking itself is possibility. Perhaps I might think something I've never thought before. And that's why we love wisdom. Philia Sophia, philosophy. So Stein then is arguing about the need for revelation, divine revelation, and the intentionality of faith in relation to the givenness of revelation. So she's arguing this kind of thing. Husserl did not go that far. But Stein is getting these ideas from Aquinas and bringing it back to phenomenology. For St. Thomas, she says faith is not irrational, because faith makes accessible truths that otherwise would remain hidden to reason. So if we have this territory of givenness that reason itself cannot procure on its own, that the limits of reason cannot discover by itself, this divine revelation, through an intentionality of faith, makes this whole world of truths accessible that are beyond the capacities of reason alone. Reason by itself is unreasonable. Reason by itself introduces more limits to itself than it has otherwise when it opens to the intentionality of faith in divine revelation. And everything philosophy may include under the concept of divinity, and moreover for phenomenology, the possibilities of divinity. Who can stubbornly close the door on the possibilities of divinity, given the mysterious wonder of ourselves? So Stein is saying there's this possibility of reason being supernaturalized to this supernatural kind of reason, a logos that expands according to the elsewhere of revelation. God, who gives the revelation accessible to faith, God's self vouches for its truth. For the believer, the certainty of faith relativizes every other certainty, because of the strength of the evidence of the data of revelation. The quality, the authenticity of the meanings of revelation surpass those of mere secular rational certainties, even mathematical ones, and the laws of physics. St. Thomas, in his work in this Sacra Scientia, Sacred Science, supplies the philosophy for life. For Thomas, God himself is the first truth. Now this especially is metaphysics here, but what is it teaching? The method of phenomenology. For phenomenology, Stein suggests the human subject is the start and center of philosophical inquiry. For Husserlian phenomenology, we have an egocentric orientation to things. It starts from the ego and ends with the ego, the living, conscious human subject. But for St. Thomas, with this metaphysics, there's a theocentric orientation to things, because the first principle is divinity, without a doubt, the uncaused cause, the unmoved mover, and so on. So if phenomenology also allows a theocentric orientation, what does that do for the method? What a beautiful thing it is when the human ego is humbled, humiliated. Because even for phenomenology, and Husserl admits this from the start, the problem is the ego is getting too much in the way of all that wants to give itself to the ego. And so in a real sense, as St. John the Baptist says, the phenomenon must increase, I must decrease. And in the case of John the Baptist, he's pointing to the apex of the phenomenality of revelation, Jesus Christ. He must increase, I must decrease. And what a happy decrease of the ego it is. So it's really interesting, in again this essay by Stein, Husserl says to Thomas, "Today I am your student, not a professor." So that's saying a lot, what Edith is setting up in the essay. Husserl being taught by Thomas, not the other way around. And then Thomas says to Husserl, "To a large extent, your inquiry and mine share a common approach." So it's not that it's kind of this totally asymmetrical relationship she's setting up between the two thinkers. But it is one of priority in terms of truth. But what Thomas is saying is that the method of inquiry of phenomenology in relation to that of metaphysics share a common approach, namely the search for essence, the essences of things. And to talk about the essence of a thing is to talk about the thing itself, starting with the thing itself. It's not the human subject that determines the essence of a thing. It's the thing itself that gives its essence for the human subject to receive and, yes, inevitably interpret, but first, and most importantly, to receive as it gives itself. So in German, there's this expression Husserl uses and Heidegger uses, and all phenomenologists, es gibt. It gives. It gives. That's what's most essential for the search for the essences of things, the es gibt. So there is phenomenological intuition as well as intentionality. And I would share my screen here, but I'm afraid it goes black, so we'll keep experimenting with that. But if we're thinking about phenomenology, it's this kind of two-way street where we have the human subject, perceiving the world. And that perception, the human subject approaching the world, is intentionality. But the world as it gives itself to the human subject, which is the more important pathway in phenomenology, is what's called intuition. Intuition intersecting with intentionality. And intuition is also the flow of givenness. All the phenomena that give themselves to the human subject and the intentionality of the subject trying to harness the magnitude of all this givenness, and usually getting overcome by its magnitude. So Jean-Luc Marion, later in phenomenology, will talk about the saturated phenomenon, where we have surplus of intuition over intentionality. And so it's like a flooding of intentionality, a flooding of ready-made concepts. And that's something that happens actually a lot in our lives. What Paul Ricoeur, David Tracy call limit experiences. Limit experiences in life that, the limits of intentionality are surpassed by what's happening. So, like the death of a loved one, for example, is a limit experience. I can try to describe what's going on, but I never can do justice to all that is happening, all that I'm feeling, all that I'm experiencing, we're experiencing. So Stein in this essay gives us a critique of armchair rationalist philosophy, what also could be called secularist philosophy. She disagrees with the turn away from the possibilities of divinity. Again, at least as a serious philosophical concept, but moreover, as a possibility always to leave open and treat with respect and, in fact, reverence. So, in the end, she talks about the possibility of a supreme philosophy, which she calls in the Latin expression the visio beatifica, the beatific vision of the heights of possibility, that is about God. And so it's really wonderful to refer to this essay of Edith Stein on Husserl and Aquinas, and thinking about the phenomenology she learned from Husserl, and then at the behest of the Jesuit Eric Chavara, she translates Thomas Aquinas, especially his work De Veritate on the disputed questions on truth, from Latin to German. And so she's taking in all of this classical metaphysics, scholastic philosophy and theology, and the unique contribution of Stein in the history of Western philosophy is to bring together in close proximity and dialogue phenomenology and metaphysics, not condensing them into one thing, but letting each be what it is, but just bringing them together, putting them in dialogue. Karol Wojtyła becomes Paul II, does similar things. Eric Chavara does similar things. Hans Urs von Balthasar at times does similar things. Karl Rahner does similar things. Paul Ricoeur does similar things. Hedwig Conrad Martius does similar things. Dietrich von Hildebrand does similar things. The several thinkers in the 20th century we see doing this. Max Scheler, in his own ways, bringing together classical metaphysics, contemporary phenomenology. Some thinkers kind of mesh the two a bit more than others, whereas what I suggest is the best approach. Let each be what it is, but allow them to complement each other, and especially to allow phenomenology to bring us back to those perennial bedrock truths of metaphysics in these questions of being. So John Paul II, to kind of close here and see if anyone has any questions, you can put in the chat. I love to entertain questions together or your comments. But John Paul II, in his 1998 encyclical Fides et Ratio, paragraph 83, says, "We face a great challenge at the end of this millennium to move from phenomenon to foundation, a step as necessary as it is urgent. We cannot stop short at experience alone, even if experience does reveal the human being's interiority and spirituality. Speculative thinking must penetrate to the spiritual core and the ground from which it rises. Therefore, a philosophy which shuns metaphysics would be radically unsuited to the task of mediation and understanding of divine revelation. So it's a very important corrective here to a lot of contemporary phenomenology that wants to bracket metaphysics and suspend it as a serious school of philosophy indefinitely. So phenomenology, by its method alone, will do that. But the philosopher need not do that. The philosopher must combine forces of these complementary methods across philosophy. And I would suggest the two best ones are phenomenology and metaphysics. So phenomenology can serve as a bridge back to the first principles of metaphysics and the foundation that it is for thought, yesterday, today, and forever. So Edith Stein was convinced about this in her life, in her work, especially her two great works, Potency and Act, and Finite and Eternal Being. So the names say a lot. They're metaphysical titles, but there's a lot of phenomenology in those books. So the point of this video is to talk about this genealogy from Husserl to Stein, with some loose reference to all the schools of phenomenology moving in and through the 20th, now the 21st century. And philosophy has always much more work to be done, but it's very exciting. I think for myself that I really look forward to investigating more experiences through phenomenology. And I'd love to do that through this YouTube channel and taking up different questions, commenting on different thinkers' work. But also I'm excited to explore metaphysics more deeply. We have so many good works to unearth in our libraries. I'm thinking of Reginald Garrigou-Lagrange, for example, the Thomist, the 20th century, who directed Karol Wojtyła's first dissertation project on the theological virtue of faith in the work of St. John of the Cross. And I'm thinking of all these things, and I love to journey with you in probing these questions. So if you're watching live, this is so cool. You can write anything in the chat, but I'll stay on a few more minutes and then maybe sum up a few more thoughts, maybe directions to go in to study the method of phenomenology further, metaphysics further. St. Thomas Aquinas, we all probably have heard, he wrote the Summa Theologiae, this sprawling, expansive work with all these various questions and this scholastic method of disputation. And he wrote a condensed version of this called the Summa of the Summa, and it's published. I'll grab it off the shelf. By Sophia Institute Press. It's this book here, Aquinas, the shorter Summa, St. Thomas Aquinas on his own concise version of the Summa Theologiae. This is a great work to get into scholastic metaphysics and the theology too of Aquinas. It's one I'd recommend most of all, like a single volume to proceed systematically through the kinds of questions he asks across his great Summa Theologiae and Summa Contra Gentiles. There's several good books, introductions to phenomenology. I highlighted my own little contribution, Phenomenology, a Basic Introduction to the Light of Jesus Christ. Also, Chad Engelin's great book published in 2020 titled Phenomenology with MIT Press. Dan Zahavi's book of 2019, Phenomenology, the Basics. Another Dan Zahavi book, Husserl's Phenomenology, published in 2003, a little more involved there, but still a good primer. And then Edmund Husserl wrote this book. I studied this with Jean-Luc Marion at University of Chicago. Edmund Husserl, The Idea of Phenomenology, very short book. These are his Paris lectures that he gave from April 26th to May 2nd, 5 lectures, 1907. Well, he first delivers in Göttingen, and these introduce the main ideas of his later phenomenology. So this is a great work. If you really want to get into the concept of givenness, Edmund Husserl, The Idea of Phenomenology. So I highly recommend this, getting into things, and maybe we'll do some video series on this book, at least parts of this book. So I see a few of you here on the live stream. If you have any questions, comments, just go ahead and put that in the chat. It's kind of the beauty of the live stream phenomenon, is a little different than Zoom, that I can't see you. I don't know who's on, but if you chime in the chat, we can have some dialogue. But I said this would be an hour long, so we still have 10 minutes. And I would love to share my screen more. I'll keep working on figuring out how to do that. I do have a share screen button, but it doesn't seem to be showing when I go to it. If I click share, I'm seeing the screen share. There we go. Maybe that's it. Can you see the screen share now? If you're watching, you can let me know in the chat. So once we get this figured out, smooth it out, it'll be a great tool to use in future videos. But if you can see the screen, again, this is what I suggest: the 4 basic steps of the method of phenomenology. Bracket, receive, describe, respond. So that's a good way to think about this. Bracket, receive, describe, respond. And then to be able to fill out those verbs with what are we bracketing, what are we receiving, what are we describing, what are we responding to. When you're teaching these kind of things, it's good to simplify the concepts, and sometimes, in a sense, oversimplify, use heuristic devices, and then people are able to understand it better. If we start with Husserl to understand Husserl, we might not in the end quite understand Husserl. So we have to be able to translate a bit from German to German, German to other languages, and then even English to English here, thinking about phenomenology. Bracket, receive, describe, respond. So this is the first shot of a live stream. I really thank everyone for stopping by while this is going on. I've really tried to add a lot to this YouTube channel, a lot of great resources, a lot more to come, and it seems the most interest in the subscribers of the channel is on phenomenology, specifically Jean-Luc Marion, Edith Stein, and company. And so I'm happy to talk more about these things, teach more about these things, and to be of a service to the common good of us seeking after the things themselves, seeking after truth. And it's a communal effort. The best discoveries are going to be collaborative ones. And so forums like this on YouTube is a great way to connect, to collaborate in a very free and open forum. So I'm really excited about these new things. And even as a scholar, like, you think about more things you can write, but you only want to write things if someone's going to read it. And in our time, like, we can have shorter attention spans sometimes. And if we publish a journal in Modern Theology or American Catholic Philosophical Quarterly or whatever, you wonder how many people will read the article. Sometimes it may not feel like enough motivation to spend hours and hours composing the article. But if you're concerned about teaching something, and you're concerned about that dialogue within this context of teaching and learning, we're looking at new platforms in our time. We're looking at things like this, like YouTube and Zoom, and especially since COVID and everything, here we are. So it's exciting, though, and we can connect across the country, across the world, and that's really wonderful thing. So why not? Again, the chat's been a little quiet tonight. That's okay. There's no pressure. You can watch the video, enjoy it, hopefully, be inspired, listen. And I'd just love to encourage you, wherever you're watching from, even if you're watching after the fact, as this is being recorded. I want to encourage you in your pursuit of clear, meaningful, and honest thinking. A thinking toward the whole. A thinking toward truth. Not a truth that we invent or manipulate, but a truth that captivates us and that calls us, perhaps even calls us by name. And we listen to this voice of truth. We perceive the manifestation of this truth. So this is real phenomenological language to think about truth, and something that Jesus says, the truth will set you free. Are we convinced by this? What would be the otherwise? Lies would set us free. If something's not the truth, we call it a lie. And so I don't think we're convinced that lies will set us free. Lies will imprison us in a world of uncertainty and confusion, skepticism at best, half-truths. But the fullness of truth is reasonable to be convinced this will set us free. So that's what I like the videos I produce to be about. Pursuing the truth that will set us free. In my own lived experience, a truth that's not just a concept, not just a worldview, a philosophy, a method, but a truth that's personal, a truth that has face and name. And I have found this living truth in Jesus of Nazareth, the fullness of God's revelation in him, and scripture and tradition in his church, the one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church. So this is the exciting pieces of theology that come if we let them. But philosophy clears away, at least in removing obstacles that would keep us from the self-revelation of truth in its fullness. So philosophy has an important task clearing away these obstacles, much like in the spiritual life, something like the sacrament of penance, confession, a removal of obstacles that get in the way of the relationship with God, that get in the way of the relationship with each other as human beings. They get in the way in our relationship with the integrity of the whole of creation, and even the relationship of the self with itself through the otherness of the other. So again, thank you so much for joining me in this video presentation. We'll see how it goes. We'll see how it's received with the recording, and if it's worthwhile to do more of these. So if you didn't leave a comment in the chat tonight, feel free to do so in the chat under the recording. So hey, thanks so much. Nice regards from Germany. What time is it there? Wow, it's got to be like 4 a.m. Guten Morgen. Dankeschön. Dankeschön for being with me, for watching. Thank you all so much. Love connecting with you. And yeah, 4 a.m. Wow, no rest for the blessed, sometimes we say. But that's means a lot that you joined me for this. And may we keep in touch. Keep in touch. So thank you so much, everyone. And look forward to more live streams to come. Gute Nacht, guten Morgen.